Hello and welcome to the very last screencast for our unit on the morality of abortion, College Now, Contemporary Moral Issues, Spring 2020 for Lehman College. So this article by Rosalind Hursthouse is called Virtue Theory in Abortion, and it begins on page 304. Hursthouse wants us to radically alter how we view the entire debate and the moral obligations involved with pregnancy and abortion. Instead of any sort of act theory of morality, meaning that we evaluate people's moral choices based on individual actions, she wants to reframe it under a virtue ethics perspective. So she goes into a bit more detail about this abstract theory of virtue ethics, or virtue theory, it's sometimes called, than we did when we looked at the bare bones of it in the beginning of the semester. So first, as a reminder of what virtue ethics are, we'll take a look at her formulation of virtue ethics, and this is pages 305, 6, and 7. And then we'll see how she applies it to the moral issue of abortion. So this is a formal way of expressing your argument. It's where you point to exactly what you count as your evidence or justification for believing something. P1 means premise 1, P1A means premise 1A, and P2, of course, means premise 2. So why would you call it A instead of just premise 2? Probably because you think you need the first part to make sense of the second part. They're connected. A is a corollary of the first part. And a corollary is just something that automatically flows. It's a logical commitment, like we talked about in the last screencast, to something you have proclaimed you believe in. Okay, so for virtue ethics, she says, the first piece of evidence or premise as to what virtue ethics is an action is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent would do in the circumstances. Okay, that's what IFF means, if and only if. So, of course, we have questions that we'll get to later. What does it mean to be a virtuous agent? What circumstances are we looking at, etc., etc.? But first, we say, here's premise 1A, a virtuous agent. So that takes away some of our questions already. A virtuous agent is one who acts virtuously. That is, one who has and exercises virtues. And I apologize for the construction noises. Hopefully you'll still be able to hear me over them. Okay, so now we can slot her definition of what a virtuous agent is into premise 1, and you can see how the two are connected. An action is right if and only if it is what one who acts virtuously, that is, one who has and exercises virtues, would do in the circumstances. So those two things are tied together. Premise 2. Now we get the definition of virtue. A virtue is a character trait a human being needs to flourish or live well. Okay. This is an important one and something that I didn't talk about in depth when we first looked at virtue ethics. We'll see a Greek word a little bit later called eudaimonia. And when virtue ethics was first formulated in its conception, well, at least we think it's historically connected all the way back to Aristotle. Excuse me. He's writing in around 250 BC. And he thought that a human being's purpose was to figure out how to live as best as they can for a human being. That given the kinds of creatures human beings are, we need all the stuff that most animals do, food and water and shelter. We need all that stuff. But to really flourish, to really live well, We need something on top of that. And then if you look back at an entire life and they have flourished, you have this thing called eudaimonia, living well, human excellence. And this argument here says that we can't live well, we can't live up to our fullest potential, we can't have the happiest, most fulfilled life possible unless we have virtues inside of our characters that we have built up over a lifetime. And you may or may not agree with that right off the bat. There are more arguments as to why that is true, but we don't need to go into it right here. We'll go into it a little bit more when we look at this next slide and this next part of her explanation of virtue ethics. So she was writing this in 1990. And at that time, in the Western world, in the Western philosophical community, moral theories were almost completely focused on act-centered theories. So that's utilitarianism and that's Kantianism. Virtue ethics hadn't been popular in moral ethical circles for generations. So because people were starting to bring it up again, it was facing a lot of objections. And she says most of them are trivial. They're just come from the fact that the people who are criticizing don't really even understand what virtue ethics are. So she says these 5 common trivial objections can be dealt with really quickly. And this is page 306, 307. Some people say eudaimonia is hopelessly obscure, and you might have thought that from my very first attempt at trying to describe it to you. What can we possibly mean by human flourishing, and how would it be universal to everybody? But she says if eudaimonia is hopelessly obscure, so are moral terms in every single theory. What does it mean to be good or bad? What does it mean to be rational? These things all need careful explanation, but they aren't hopelessly obscure. We all know what they mean, at least in general. She also says virtue theory is not circular. It does answer the questions, what should I do in any specific situation, in addition to the question of what sort of person should I be. The 4th one is, though virtue ethics is not supposed to be rule-based. So think about utilitarianism and Kantianism. They're both rule-based. I'm presented with a question. Should I do A? Should I do B? Kantianism gives you a rule. Do what you can universalize. Do what you're not using another human being for. Utilitarianism gives you a rule. Do what increases the utility the most. But virtue ethics isn't supposed to be rule-based. It's supposed to be, I'm cultivating the kind of character in which I do the right thing for the right reasons at the right time. But it does give you some rules for that then, right? They might not be perfectly true or false in every single situation. But if I have A or B, I ask myself, what would a virtuous person do? And that's a kind of rule. And she says that virtue ethics is not reductionist, which means that, okay, we haven't necessarily encountered this concept yet. A physical reductionist would say that everything in the universe boils down to the atoms or the quarks or the electrons and how they move around. So that means consciousness, society, money, all of our emotions aren't the most fundamental or real thing about the universe. They reduce to the physical mass or matter. So when you say something like virtue ethics is reductionist, mean that the thing that is most fundamental is the only thing that's important. Everything else reduces to it. So she says virtue ethics is not reductionist to the virtuous agent, meaning that there are other concepts that are just as fundamentally important, like goodness, what's worthwhile, what you should be striving for, can totally be separately defined away from the virtuous agent. And it's okay if one or more of these is confusing or obscure to you. They are actually probably the sort of most technical sort of things that we've studied so far in a philosophical sense. So it's good that we are being introduced to them, but it is okay if they are not immediately understandable to you. I think that her argument about abortion will be quite a bit more straightforward than this more abstract theorizing. She does think that there is one criticism that she has consistently gotten in her presentation of virtue ethics that has a lot more substance. It might be more of a real objection, not a trivial objection. And she gives a very long quote on page 306, quoting Honora O'Neill, who is a well-known Kantian moral theorist, saying her problems with virtue ethics. And it comes down to two basic things. You worry that if you're looking to virtuous agents in your community to emulate, so you're again presented with A or B to choose. And in order to choose, you think, what would a virtuous agent do? But how do we learn what a virtuous agent is? We have to look around us and see who we think is virtuous. So some people say that virtue ethics can never really improve all that much because it's conservative, it's looking backward, it's basing what it's right to do on what other people are already doing. There's no objective standard of goodness, so all we care about is the status quo in our place, in our time. And the second problem is that nobody agrees on what it means to be good or what it means to be virtuous. Nobody agrees on what's worthwhile to pursue as a goal in life. And when you say, okay, I'm going to choose A, I'm going to choose B, because this is what a virtuous agent would do, you have an implicit understanding of what it means to be good that you never argue for. And that is not a great trait in a theory. You always want to justify or provide evidence for all of your theories. And if you just ignore that you've never defined something, your argument isn't as strong as it could be. She responds to this by saying, and this is still technical a little bit, so maybe we'll skip this first paragraph. Well, no, I guess this is relatively understandable. She says all serious moral theories have to deal with these questions. Again, everybody, every human being, or at least most, have some understanding of what goodness is, what virtue is, what it means to live a worthwhile life that they bring to the table. Would we rather argue with a person who's completely confused about this, say an android or an alien that has no concept of human morality? No, we realize that though we might disagree on the specifics, when we have a discussion, we always bring our own pre-philosophical beliefs to the table. So it's no help to point out that you need to define these things because every theory needs to define these things. I have a note. She doesn't talk about this, but one way other virtue theorists break out of the this is too conservative, this is just based on the status quo argument, saying, well, that's why reflective reasoning matters. Yes, you look to your community to see what a virtuous agent is, but then you think it through yourself, and that is how virtue ethicists argue we can improve morally underneath virtue ethics. So if you look around you and you see, well, this is the thing that people are saying is virtuous, but I disagree with it, and here's why. So I'm going to behave in this way instead. You're still being a virtue ethicist, and you're trying to improve. Okay, so finally now we're going to look at virtue ethics and abortion, and this begins on page 307. So recall, and I mentioned this again, virtue ethics doesn't care as much about individual actions as it does about being the right sort of person, with the right sort of knowledge about the situation, and acting in the right sort of way. And right here does not mean moral. It means true or false. Okay? So you can't have false beliefs about the situation to make a good choice. And that seems pretty straightforward, I think. If you have a false belief, let's say, about a fetus, and you think that it's going to have a congenital heart condition that is so bad it is going to suffer a lot if it's born and die young. But you're wrong about that. That is important. And virtue ethics, that there is a true or false sort of way to choose which option is virtuous. So you have to know how life is to be a virtue ethicist. You need experience. You have to know what your actions are going to do in the world, or going to do to you. And every relevant situation matters. Your emotions, physical consequences, etc., etc. So concretely, a concrete example. In all three of these cases, the death of a child, a miscarriage, or an abortion, they are all a loss of life. And sometimes the act theorists ignore how important that is to human life. When we lose a life, regardless of whether or not it counts as human or fully human, we feel it deeply. It's a serious matter that strikes right at the heart of what's important to us. And if we want to have a good moral theory, we have to contend with the fact that it has that deep of a ramification in human life. Hearst House acknowledges that people have individual human rights. The woman has the right over her own body, and that's fine. But rights aren't the only thing of moral value in human life. And when you have a set of rights, whether it's over your own body, free speech, the right not to be killed, etc., etc., you can exercise those rights in a virtuous way or an unvirtuous way. Okay, so if we're adherents of virtue ethics, we want to take our set of rights that every other human being also has, and we want to exercise them in our choices in such a way that takes seriously the circumstances of our lives. So you can exercise your right over your own body in a noble way, in a selfless way, or you can exercise them in what she calls a self-indulgent, callous, irresponsible, or light-minded way with regard to the real circumstances of life. Okay, so she says every situation has relevantly different facts, and that if you're a virtue ethicist, you have to understand those facts as well as you can, or you're not making the right choice. And then you have to consider how those facts, quote, figure in the practical reasoning, actions, passions, thoughts, and reactions of the virtuous and the non-virtuous. What's the mark of having the right attitude to facts? And what manifests the wrong attitude? And again, here we mean not moral, but true or false. So she says, for the most part, the way humanity works, and you learn this through experience, that family, parenthood, and children are deeply ingrained into what we think is important or valuable about being human. And those are relevant facts. So we can't take abortion lightly because family, parenthood, and children are so deeply ingrained in our value system. So abortion and loss of life or potential life is so serious when you enact it, it can only be virtuous in very narrow circumstances. And she gives a bunch of examples. I only mention a few. You can look to more examples, pages 308, 9, and 10, and so on, I guess even further too. She says, okay, if the mother's life is really difficult, or she's exhausted from previous childbirth, or she has lots of other kids, it wouldn't be non-virtuous to acknowledge that another pregnancy or childbirth would be harmful to her family, to her other children, to her spouse. She gives examples of, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of poor Victorian women had to work in coal mines. And can you imagine going into a coal mine to mine while pregnant? It's not good for you. It's not good for the fetus. And if she had to stop working, she may not be able to support her other children or her family. She points out that sometimes the unvirtuous or the very unlucky put themselves into these circumstances through their own choices. If you're a drug addict, you perhaps have, you chose to take the drugs at the very beginning, even if addiction later on took over. Or if you were unlucky and born into a circumstance where you had no moral role models whatsoever. So you might have put yourself into the circumstances that lead you to considering an abortion. But the abortion itself still might be virtuous because it may be better to not bring an addicted fetus to term. She says this is something is amiss in the conditions of their lives that should be remedied for the future. But right now, perhaps the abortion would be the virtuous choice. Okay, so her conclusion, of course, then, is that the choice to have an abortion is morally acceptable if it's done for virtuous reasons, in the right circumstances, by a person who has the right sort of attitude toward the relevant facts, which is, of course, that human life values family, parenthood, and children quite seriously. So recall this concept of eudaimonia that we talked about, living a good life, living up to the fullest of your potential. That means you have to choose worthwhile tasks. And what does a worthwhile task mean? It means something that has deep value and meaning, which of course parenthood does for the average. I don't want to say for the average human being. I want to say it's woven deeply into human life. So it has meaning. It's worthwhile. It's not the only human endeavor or task that has meaning or is valuable, but it is a central one. Okay, so she doesn't give any firm yes-no answers, but she does say that instead of looking at rights, instead of looking at killing and suffering and the right to your own body, we should be looking at the real facts of life, and saying that if you strive to make your choices virtuous, sometimes abortion will be morally acceptable, and sometimes it will not be. And she says, of course, her article has been directed toward women who can get pregnant, but every single one of her arguments she thinks can be applied to boys and men with some minor tweaks, because of course they have a stake in whether or not abortion is morally acceptable. I only have here a long quote from page 312 to 313. I'm going to read it to you, and this is in her conclusion. Okay, let's see where I want to start. It's the very last sentence on page 312. Proceeding as it does in the virtue and vice related terms, the discussion thereby inevitably also contains claims about what is worthwhile, serious, important, good, and evil in our lives. So, for example, I claim that parenthood is intrinsically worthwhile and that having a good time is a worthless end in life, not on individual occasions. That losing a fetus is always a serious matter, albeit not a tragedy in itself, especially in the first trimester, whereas acquiring an appendectomy scar is a trivial one. That human death is an evil. Once again, these are difficult matters, and anyone might challenge any one of my claims. But what is at issue, as before, is should those difficult claims be there, or can one reach practical conclusions about real moral issues, which are in no way determined about premises of such matters? So, of course, we're always going to debate about what life is like. But it isn't the case that there isn't something life is like for everybody. And we have to take those things into account when we decide whether or not something is okay to do. Okay. That wraps up section 7 in the textbook about the moral acceptability of abortion. Please comment below or in the discussion thread on Blackboard if you have a question or comments. And I'll see you next time, starting an entirely different topic.